there are two types of people. There are people who like to dive in at the deep end and people who just like to tiptoe into the water. I like to dive into the deep end. So I'd say just go cold turkey. Just cut it out completely. And yes, you will feel dreadful. Just like any addict we know, if they stop their addiction, what do? They dive into withdrawal symptoms. So if you're going to do it that way, you choose a time when, it doesn't matter if you feel awful for a few days, because you come out of it very quickly and you only consume the non-addictive foods. In fact, a very good start for many is a carnivore diet. There is nothing unhealthy about a carnivore diet: meat, fish, and eggs. And then the rules are very simple. You can have, and fatty meats, of course, are ideal. Say for many people that suits, especially the blokes, because they think, well, I'll get lots of protein, I'll get my muscles strong again, won't I? So that's a useful start. But as I say, apply my addiction test to any foods you may be having, and just get off those. And that is a fantastically good start.
And what about the carnivore diet long term? Is there any reason to switch out other than for our taste buds?
No, it's perfectly healthy. I have a very good friend of mine. She is a consultant psychiatrist. She has been carnivore for over 5 years, and she's completely healthy. In fact, that is the starting point for all the patients she's seeing, for the schizophrenics, for the manic depressives, for the bipolars. They do fantastically well on a carnivore diet. Yep, you'd add in some vitamins and minerals as well, because we know they're additionally helpful. But nothing unhealthy about a carnivore diet. That's sustainable for years. I mean, in the early 1980s, when I first started in this whole business, the classic allergy diet was a lamb, pears and rice diet. And okay, that was fairly low allergen, but the problem is it's high carbohydrate. And you get occasional patients you see, you put them on a restricted diet and they get stuck on it. They suddenly find anything they bring in is a bad idea. But the joy of the carnivore diet is that would not be an issue. You can happily live on a carnivore diet long term and be perfectly healthy.
Okay, let's bring the microbiome into this, because the automatic pushback from the conventional thinking would be, okay, now I'm not taking in any fiber. My microbiome needs fiber for food. How do you look at that?
That's a very, very good question. And I don't have all the answers to that. But as my dear friend Rachel pointed out, there is meat fiber. And, bacteria and yeast, we can't digest everything that's in meat. And bacteria and yeast will happily digest meat fiber, that's in sinew, connective tissue. So you want to eat not just pure meats. You want to eat as many cheap cuts as you possibly can. Organ meats, liver, heart. And I'm quite sure that primitive woman would have eaten, gut, testicle, the whole lot. So that would impact. But again, when the carnivores do microbiome tests, we don't know much about the microbiome. But what we do know is the more diverse it is, the healthier they are. And they do seem to have a diverse microbiome. So, but I have to say, when I tried a carnivore diet, it did make me constipated. So if I have somebody who does a pure carnivore diet, I say try and get in a few really high fiber foods like linseed, for example. That's 26% fiber. That helps hugely.
Make your bread.
Yes. And it's very easy to make. I am no cook, I can promise you, but even I can make it. I got up early every morning for about 6 months because I knew that for a paleo keto diet to be successful, we needed a good bread substitute. And I got up early for 6 months, and I needed something for people who don't have the time, the energy, or the inclination. They had to tick those 3 boxes. And yes, the linseed bread is quick and easy to make. I make a loaf most days, and it disappears either down my throat or the rest of the tribes. And you can make various changes to it. So yesterday, I did a long walk with friends, and I made a batch of PK bread, but I made it with lots of eggs, some sunflower seeds, just a few raisins to give it a bit of sweetness. And it's almost like a ship's biscuit. I just ate that through the day, and that powered me through the day, no problem at all.
Okay, so for somebody who adopts a carnivore diet or low carb diet, but they were previously in that boat we talked about early on with the upper fermenting gut, talk about that period of time early on and how quickly things start to turn around. Oh, and you did mention the fact that it's not going to be easy, this addiction piece. anything we can do in that early phase to tame that?
Well, there are several problems that can arise. The first problem is what we call keto flu, because what is as important as being ketosis is the metabolic flexibility to be able to switch to being, sometimes we would be carbohydrate burning, maybe, because guess what? At weekends, I will feast. I'm a keen gardener. I've got strawberries in the garden. Am I going to not eat strawberries in the strawberry season? No. So I might be hopping out of ketosis occasionally, but that's fine. That metabolic flexibility to be able to burn sugars for a time and then get back into a fat burning mode is important. But if that's never happened, and for many people, they've never been in ketosis all their lives because they've never not had 3 carbohydrate meals a day. They've been bought on that, and that's what they're stuck with. And initially, fat burning can be a problem to some people. And we need thyroid hormones to be able to fat burn. And, if the thyroid is not working properly or is running a bit low, then you will fat burn with adrenaline instead. And that makes people feel terrible. It makes them feel wired but tired. I think much of keto flu is ketogenic hypoglycemia, as I call it. Dreadful name. But you feel hypoglycemic. Actually, you're not. But you feel it because you haven't got the thyroid hormones to fat burn. And in fact, that's often a very good clue that that person has an underactive thyroid. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. The second thing is, as you get rid of your upper fermenting gut, those microbes die off. And as they die off, they get digested by acid and by enzymes, and you can get allergic reactions to the dead microbes. It's called a Herxheimer reaction. So that's something to look out for. And the other point is when you get into ketosis and you start burning fat, you start to mobilize toxins which are stuck in fat. Now, I've done many fat biopsies. Very easy test to do. You just stick a needle in somebody's fat, pull the needle out, and the fat within the core of the needle is sufficient for analysis. Now, the results come back in milligrams per kilogram. If I do a blood test, the results come back in micrograms per kilogram. That tells you those toxins are in fat as 100 to 1,000-fold higher than in the bloodstream. So when you lose weight, when you burn fat, you mobilize those toxins and you get an acute poisoning. So you can get a poisoning result. These problems are detailed on my website under DDD reactions: diet, detox, and die-off reactions. And that gives you a clue to the sort of symptoms you can expect. And there isn't an easy way around it. Because just like there isn't an easy way to stop smoking, there's not an easy way to come off alcohol. You just have to make your mind up and do it. Sometimes sipping salty water, water with some salt in it, or bone broth helps to mitigate the hunger pangs, but it's just the phase you have to go through. And then when you come out the other end and you suddenly realize that actually the brain's working again, that you have got some energy, that you don't need to sleep 12 hours a day, that you're not constantly yawning, that you can function at a much higher level, then you suddenly realize how you can be. And that is a real eye-opening wake-up call. And having appreciated that good health bit, then you're better empowered to stick with the diet. But what I can tell you is nobody does it perfectly first time and sticks with it for life. I think of it as a bit of an earthquake. So the initial earthquake is when you do it for the first time. You think, oh gosh, yes, I do feel better, and then you lapse. Oh, I fancy a bit of chocolate. Oh, I fancy a bit of this. And you go back, and then you think, no, I must get back on the wagon again, and you get back on, and it's like an earthquake with tremors. And sometimes I don't even believe the evidence of my own eyes. Sometimes I think, nah, it's a load of rubbish, and I see something I'm tempted by, and then I consume it, and I feel dreadful. I think, no, not doing that again. So we're constantly having to learn and relearn and reinforce that as just a part of normal life. It's just the way that humans are made.
Let's come back to the thyroid piece. How many people are affected by that? And is this something that just corrects itself when you move through the process?
If you're young, it might. So ketogenic hypoglycemia was first described by the pediatricians because in the 1950s and the 1960s and before, when we had no anti-epilepsy drugs, the treatment for epilepsy was a ketogenic diet. And guess what? The kids did very well, but they didn't like it, but it stopped their fitting. Some kids develop ketogenic hypoglycemia. They just felt so awful on the diet, and they really struggled with it. And they were the ones They felt like they got low blood sugar, although when their blood sugar was tested, it was normal. They were the ones that were hypothyroid, I think, and they just seem to grow out of their problems. So yes, the young people, if they're lucky, they can adjust. But the underactive thyroid is extremely common, especially in women, often unmasked at the menopause. In fact, Kenneth Braverman, who's an American cardiologist, wrote a book about this. He reckons that about a third of Westerners have an underactive thyroid. So it is a very common problem. And I think that's because the thyroid is easily damaged. It's damaged by toxins because so many people are drinking fluoridated water or having fluoridated toothpaste. It's damaged by bromide compounds, and we use polybrominated biphenyls as fire retardants. It's damaged by heavy metals, and guess what? We are all poisoned to a certain extent by lead, mercury, arsenic, aluminium. It's very susceptible to viral infection. It's the first thing to be targeted when there's autoimmunity, and that is switched on by vaccines. So there are many ways by which the thyroid gland can be damaged. And because the descent into the underactive thyroid is insidious, it's gradual, it's often not noticed. And, women in particular are just told, oh, you're getting old, stop fussing, it's the menopause, the excuse, or you're too strict. Excuses are made instead of people really doctors really looking at the symptoms and really looking at the blood tests. And there's a second problem here, because doctors so often only diagnose an underactive thyroid on the blood tests. They ignore the clinical picture, which might be, slow descent into fatigue, slow pulse at rest, low core temperature, loss of hair in the eyebrows or the hair, swelling. Another name for the underactive thyroid is mixed edema, retaining fluid. So carpal tunnel syndrome, when you get numbness and tingling of those fingers and half of the ring finger, that would again suggest the diagnosis of hypothyroidism. Voice changes because the larynx becomes edematous, and sometimes you get a croaky voice like that, like what you've been smoking for 20 years but you haven't. Those, or loss of singing voice. Those are all symptoms that point to an underactive thyroid, and of course, as we've discussed, ketogenic hypoglycemia. The blood tests then tell us if there's biochemical scope for a trial of thyroid hormones, because the point here is that all diagnosis is hypothesis. So if somebody comes to see me, I say, I think you've got this, I think you've got that, I think you've got the other. But the real diagnosis is retrospective. If they get better as a result of your interventions, then you say, yep, that was the problem. You're eating the wrong food, you had a fermenting gut, you had a low thyroid, your mitochondria were out, or whatever. But as I say, the underactive thyroid is very common.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
The upper fermenting gut is a major, major problem. It goes almost unrecognised by the conventional doctors. We have to get rid of the upper fermenting gut. And yes, there's a two-pronged approach. Yes, we starve them out with a low-carb ketogenic diet. And secondly,